everybody, to the Truthful Hope Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Vazquez, and today we're going to talk about, we're going to answer an age-old yet critical question: what is truth? And this question was asked even in the time of Jesus. And while Jesus was on trial, Pilate said to Jesus, "So you are king?" And Jesus answered, "You say that I'm king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." And Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And that's John 18. So, what is truth? And what worldview best explains truth? Is truth merely true for me, but not true for someone else? Is it subjective and that's it? Or is there such thing as universal truths that we all have to come under? That's the question that we're going to be answering. And to help me address this really important topic, I have joining me today Dr. Joseph R. Miller, who has a doctorate in ministry from Biola University, a PhD in ethics from Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's an associate professor of Christian Worldview at Grand Canyon University, the co-founder and president of Center for Cultural Apologetics, a fellow at Reasons to Believe, and the assistant director of RC Prof at Ratio Christi. That's a mouthful, Joe, but thank you so
Yeah.
much for joining today.
Hey, good to have you, brother. So nice to be here, Jacob. Thanks for the invite, and I'm looking forward to this conversation because I do think it's one of the most critical ones we have today. I mean, it's true in any generation, but I think given our cultural context, it's really critical.
Right, absolutely. Well, it's an honor to have you on. And on your Substack, that's how we got connected. You sent me your Substack link, and it's for our listeners. It's at morethancake.org, which we'll put in the show notes. But you release numerous short videos on the most important topics like worldviews, epistemology, Christology, theology, all the ologies,
Yeah.
abortion, transgenderism, all the cultural issues as well. So today I do want to talk about, I want to pick one of those topics out and specify on truth, because like you said, it's critical for the cultural, where we are as a culture. Really, it's essential. But before we do that, I have to ask you, where did the More Than a Cake name come from?
Yeah, so years ago, when I started internet blogging, writing, and that sort of thing, never a big fan of using my own name, like the Joseph R. Miller Ministries. Plus, my name's boring, and try to find Joe Miller on the internet, and you'll never find me. So that's why I ended up writing under J.R. Miller. I thought that'll help people find me. No, because there's some dude in the 1800s. It was a theologian that will get the first 10,000 page hits on that one. But I'm sort of adverse to using my name anyway. And so I wanted to pick another name. And I chose More Than Cake because at the time, a lot of my focus was pastoral ministry. And I was at 20 some years in pastoral ministry, preaching and teaching. But I felt like there was a lack of substance from the pulpit. And so what kind of came to mind was that whole Marie Antoinette, sort of the French Revolution, the people are starving, and bread was sort of the main staple of what people would eat. Now, the idea was that she didn't care, so the the word that comes out is she said, "Let them eat cake." Now, she probably never said that, but that idea, that queenly attitude of, well, we don't care about the peasantry, don't give them the nourishing food that's going to sustain them. Give them a confection, a cake that will taste good. It will fill their little tummies, but they'll never actually receive the nutrition they need. And I felt like that's where we got a lot of the in our preaching. Paul said, giving milk instead of solid food. Same kind of principle. I just wanted to have a site where I was offering more than cake.
So good. It's a clever name. I didn't know there was that much substance to it. It just kind of made me hungry,
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you. Hungry for truth,
Yeah.
we'll say that.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
That's plays off.
I could do this marketing too. We're good. We got this.
Yeah.
So
You're
let's jump
hired.
right into it. Let's jump right into it, Joe. Just to set the stage for our listeners, what is truth? And just at the basis of it.
Yeah, obviously, get 10 philosophers in a room, you'll find 75 definitions, and there's people going to argue, and even Christians want to argue, and I'm not concerned about all those things. But what I tell my students when I talk about this, and I think this makes sense, is I use a sort of a modified version of the correspondence theory of truth, and it simply means this: truth is anything that corresponds to reality. Whether that's a claim, like a proposition, or a fact, or my feelings, whatever it is we're talking about, a table, the fact that we're doing a podcast, anything that corresponds to what is real is true. Okay. And I think that works as a baseline definition because even if people want to argue about philosophical distinctions and nuances, the reality is if we're going across the street and we see a car coming, regardless of our worldview, we all pause for the car because we know that if that big heavy object hits me as a smaller object, I will be crushed. So there's something real there. And so functionally, I think we all accept and live by that definition, even though philosophically and worldview wise, we like to deny that definition. So I think it's a very practical one that's pretty useful in most conversations.
So good. Yeah, so I love it. It corresponds with reality. So my
Mhm.
follow-up to that, and you mentioned this in the intro, why does it matter so much that we understand what truth is?
Yeah, I think when we're trying to make sense of, say, all the political conflict that we see around us, go spend any time on the internet, on social media, and we see how there's just the most bitter debates and fractions that occur. Even a coldness between Christians who, oh, you can't be a real Christian because you accept this, or you voted this way, or you believe this truth, or you believe that truth. And what we really see in the culture is what we've started to argue over, even amongst Christians, is what counts as truth. What sources of media are giving me what is true? What is fact? What is fiction? What is narrative? What is real and not real? All these ways of arguing. So if we have any hope of reconciliation, of bringing some sense of unity, even amongst Christians, we've got to understand what truth is and understand how different worldviews offer different definitions, different things that they will accept as true. Right? If I'm trying to persuade an atheist, hey, the Bible's real, he says, well, no, it's not. And if I said, well, what evidence would you accept? Until I know that, I can't actually answer his question. Right. Because if he says, oh, I reject all archaeological evidence, not that they would, but I'm saying, if they did that, well, then giving archaeological evidence wouldn't make a difference. So we have to know what people will accept as truth before we can have a common foundation for, okay, well, hey, we can agree with this area, this counts as truth. Now let's work from this agreed upon point of truth to some bigger unified field of what counts as truth. So apologetically, I think this becomes one of the most fundamental questions towards persuading people of the truth of God, or just even resolving political conflicts.
So good. And I feel like we all live to our truth, like to the truth that we hold to. So if you're living in a
Hmm.
subjective manner, like, oh, truth is just whatever I feel, you're going to
Yeah.
behave and hold values to that mindset, that ideology, you can call it. And if it's not true to reality, like you said, like the definition of truth is, then I think what comes from that is chaos.
Yeah.
Maybe not in the moment, but down the road. So it's critical that we focus on what is truth and then live that out accordingly. In your short videos, which are incredible. So our listeners, you have to go check these out. I think, Joe, maybe from what I saw, 3 to 4 minutes a video. Is that what you were aiming
Yeah, the
for?
max, the top end is the lowest is like a little bit over two, and the highest is five. So they're all less than 5 minute videos, and they're meant as supplementals to larger teachings, but used to create conversations and say like a small group. You want to talk about one of these issues of truth. So a
Mm.
video, then there's questions at the end of most of them, but to generate dialogue. Yeah.
It's so good. So to our listeners, go check that out, morethanacake.com. But from one of them, I think it's from
.org.
the there's
Morningcake.org. If you go to morningcake.com, you
.org.
will get cake recipes. At least you used to.
So maybe do that too. It's not the worst thing. But in the on the concept of truth, I think it's a two-parter. I think in part one, you distinguish between absolute truth and then temporal truth.
Mhm.
What are the three temporal truths that you explained in the video?
Yeah, so I divide truth into two big categories, and that is the category of absolute truth, which is all truth that is grounded or related to the nature of God. Okay, so most every Christian would say, okay, I accept that. But the three temporal truths are truths that are in some way connected to the reality which God created, the physical, material reality of our world or our lives or our experience. And those things are still true, but in some way they are potentially subject to change, unlike what is absolute. Now, traditional correspondence theories will often say absolute truth, they use objective truth. The reason I don't like that for the truth about God is that I do think even our temporal truths can be objective. In other words, they can be external to the individual, but they change. They're tied to time, space, reality. That's why I call them temporal truths. So they're tied to those realities. And those three temporal truths I talk about are contingent, synthetic, and subjective truths.
It's really good. Do you want to unpack those three truths for us
Yeah.
a bit?
Yeah. So as I said, the absolute is just propositions, any kind of statements, any realities grounded in the person of God. The first temporal truth I talk about is contingent truth. These are propositions or statements, any kind of those sort of things that are purely that are connected to observations that are or discovered through, say, scientific observation. Okay, so that's our first one is contingent truths. And I can give an example of each of these as we go along, but maybe I'll just define all three first and kind of let you take the lead where you want to go. So that's our
Sure.
first temporal truth is contingent truth. Propositions related to, that can be verified or falsified through scientific observations, those sorts of things. Then there's synthetic truths. Synthetic truths are related to things that through cultural consensus. And these are kind of the truths that shape institutions. Okay, so synthetic truths, think of a synthetic blend, right? If you make a wool, like wool and some other, it's a synthesizing, a meshing of things. So this is the cultural consensus kind of truth. And then there's subjective truth, which are propositions or realities that are, or propositions or statements or claims or whatever that are totally related internally to the person. So these are purely internal sort of truths. The my truth sort of thing, if you will, and we can get to why I actually think that that's an important category of truth that unfortunately I think a lot of Christian apologists reject outright, and I think they make a mistake in doing that. But those are the three temporal truths.
Really good. And to that point, to follow up on what you just said, I loved how you built out the concept of truth because, like you said, a lot of apologists and a lot of Christians, they distinguish between objective and subjective truth and then just throw everything subjective out the window. At least that's what it seems in their
Hmm.
arguments. And it's just everything is
Yeah,
objective. I think it's a mistake to throw out subjective truth. We could the discussion should be instead is what is the foundation of that subjective truth? Is the subjective
exactly.
truth the foundation of itself, or is it objective? But to throw out things like I'm hungry or I like vanilla ice cream more than chocolate, it is true that I like vanilla ice cream more than
Yes.
chocolate.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and it might actually persuade me or influence me to do certain things out in the world that impacts others. So it's
Hmm.
not irrelevant to your point. So I really, really like the way you did this. Um, you gave a really good illustration, and it was where you have the absolute truth is the seed of a flower or a
Hmm.
plant, so to speak,
Hmm.
and then the temporal truths were the blossoms, the flowers that came about. And you shown the relationship between absolute and temporal was that the flowers that came about, if you were to cut them off and put them in a vase, they would eventually wither and die. Can you
Yeah.
unpack that illustration? Because I thought it was super helpful.
Yeah. So the thing, and you hit the nail on the head. The thing a lot of apologists, and I get it, it works for sort of a bumper sticker approach to it. Oh, there's not your truth, there's not my truth, there's only what the truth or God's truth. I get why that works, but it only actually addresses one worldview concern of subjectivism. But it also really undermines something critical to our evangelism. And this is why the flower analogy makes so much sense, or why it's so valuable. Because if we tell people their experience doesn't matter or have anything to do with truth, what happens when I have an experience or encounter with the risen Jesus Christ? I mean, our whole relationship with God is experienced relationship, and that is an argument in favor of the truth of God and the reality of God. It's in philosophy they call it truth by acquaintance, knowledge by acquaintance, right? So we can have experience that gives us something access to what is truth if that corresponds to reality. The flower analogy kind of does this. It says, look, but even those claims, even those personal subjective claims are only true if they correspond to what is real, if they're rooted in something that is objectively true, of some reality. So you take the seed of the flower, which represents the absolute truth of God. And then you get how that flower, that seed gives birth, flourishes in this sort of subjective or synthetic or contingent truths that come out in the day-to-day life that we live. That's when they flourish, right? But as soon as you, like, anytime you see a beautiful flower, you cut it off, put it in a vase, it looks great for a while, but eventually it fades. This is the kind of thing we have with truth. So, for example, if I say the truth of marriage is between one man and one woman, at some point, the culture agrees with that and the culture flourishes. That's a synthetic truth. Hey, we're going to have a law that says only men and women can be married, one man, one woman. But when you cut that truth of contract marriage in the law from the absolute truth, the seed of God, and you put it in a vase, it looks great. The culture goes on for a while, but eventually people say, well, hey, why would we just restrict it to one man or one woman, or one man, and why not one man and another man, or two women and three, men, or whatever, polyamorous relationships. So eventually that beauty of that flower fades because we no longer see that claim of marriage between one man and one woman as the ideal for society. We don't see it tied to anything absolute or objective in that sense. And this is what happens with all of these truths. But as long as it's tied to that, the culture, even though it's a synthetic truth, like say what the law of what marriage is, even though that's a synthetic truth, what constitutes legal marriage, it can still reflect something of the beauty of God because it's tied to that.
Mm. That is so good. And as you were talking, I just thought of this like summary, and it's I was essentially thinking like, are you living in the vase or are you living in the soil? Be like, and
Mm,
my mindset of that is your foundation the vase where you have the cut flowers, or
hmm
is your foundation the seed? And if it's
hmm
the vase, then you're just living from that subjective truth, and it'll only last you so long. Like you said, you'll start
Yeah.
questioning, well, why do we have to live by this again? Can't we just change it up and reorganize the flowers? But if you're living in the seed, it's you start there and you start at the
hmm
absolute, and then from that comes a subjective. So that is just incredible, an incredible illustration. Um, in part two of your video, so that was part one, and I think it was super helpful just to give an overview of truth. But in part two, you dive a bit deeper into the application of truth according to worldviews, which I absolutely loved. And I know you teach on worldviews, so it's it's your niche, so to speak. Um,
Yeah.
we did a episode in the past on worldviews, but I honestly feel like we could do an episode a week on worldviews, and it wouldn't be enough.
Yeah.
that's how
Yeah.
that's how important it is. So I'm totally fine with going over that information and address worldviews again. But you apply the flower analogy to worldviews, and you bracket them into two categories: naturalism and supernaturalism.
hmm
Can you unpack these two worldviews for us? But maybe before that, just explain what is a worldview, and then go into those two categories for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So worldview, the definition that I use is a worldview is it's the framework we use. You could say it's our philosophy, it's our ideas, it's our concepts. It's the way we approach life and decision making. What job will I take? What relationship will I have? All of that decision making process, right? All pulls together, but we're all trying to answer those basic questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Where did I come from? Why am I here? What's the existence? What's the purpose of my life? What's the right thing to do in any given context or any circumstance? How is my life going to be judged? And what happens when I die? And there's these basic worldview questions we're all trying to deal with. And worldview is the way of pulling that all together and saying, aha, I think I have a comprehensive answer to those things. Because that's what we're trying to get. We're trying to seek that comprehensive answer. And that's why we have a lot of anxiety within the cultures, because when we can't make a comprehensive, coherent answer to all those questions, we realize that our beliefs about our origins don't match with our beliefs about what's morally right or the future, then we end up with anxiety and depression, suicidality. So we need to have consistency in those. And that's what worldview promises us, but not all of them can deliver. And that's why the two basic categories then I have are sort of the supernaturalism and the naturalism. And there's a lot of ways that divide. I have a whole thing or what are my worldview options. And you see there's one that's a 5-minute video on that. I actually have one that breaks down that in a way more complex way. I'm still trying to think about how I want to teach that, but I've got about 30 different options under each of those two big categories, and it gets very complex. But I think it's super helpful
Mm.
to understand how these different worldview families, because think of worldviews more as a family of ideas more than a set group of ideas, because people will borrow from this idea or that, or they sort of interconnect in some way. But those two big categories are, does God exist or does God not exist, right? The naturalism would say there is no God. The natural physical world is all there is. Supernaturalism, which includes Christianity, but it could also include things like pantheism or polytheism. It says that there must be something beyond the physical world. There is some supernatural thing that's beyond the tangible natural world that we exist. And so the way I do it in that video is I say, okay, I'm just going to pick Christianity as the representative of the supernaturalistic worldview and say, okay, here's the triune God of the Bible who's absolute, eternal, all those sort of qualities of God, and then compared to 4 different kinds of naturalistic worldviews. And the ones I chose are just dominant within the culture today. These are the ones competing for the attention of our children. I pick Marxism, scientism, postmodernism, and subjectivism, or relativism. Either of those labels are fine, but I choose relativism just to not confuse it with my what I call subjective truth. But I pick those 4 as representative of the naturalistic worldview families because I think those are the ones that I see in most, social media posts, young college students, and just the books being written.
Yeah, it's a great definition of a worldview. It's like your lenses, right? The glasses you
Mhm.
wear that you and I are wearing right now, and like the prescription is set, and I could see really clearly, and it corresponds with reality, so I'm seeing clearly. But if I have a misstep in my diagnosis or whatever, or my prescription, it's going to be very blurry. And my personal conversion to Christianity, what it did feel like, I had blurry vision until I tore down my worldview and adapted a Christian worldview, and it just fit better with reality. So it was much clearer.
Yeah.
We've had John Noyes on. He's an apologist to stand to reason. He said he was an atheist and he went to Christianity all because of worldview, that he was looking
Mm.
at the world from a naturalistic standpoint. So any talk of God, miracles, the soul was just written off from the jump without even looking into the evidence. So it's crucial, as you mentioned. But did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, let me just jump in on one thing on that because
Sure.
I don't know if you happen to see I have the one video, part 1 of the what the Bible is. I'm actually working on part 2 right now. Hopefully, I have part 3 done before school starts in the fall. Those are my 2 big ones I'm hoping to get done, but lots of rewrites on my script. But the part 1, I use that exact thing. Worldview is like a lens, but we should never confuse the Bible is not a worldview. Now, the Bible is influenced by worldview. In other words, the writer Paul had a worldview, or Moses had a worldview, and God uses their worldview to relate something that is true outside of worldview. So, in that analogy, if we're trying to read an eye chart in the doctor, right, our lenses are going to be the thing that helps us read that chart. But when it's blurry, the Bible comes in as the instrument to refine and to grind those lenses and to clarify our worldview, to give us an access to what is true, to what is real. And so when people think of worldview, I do think that misunderstanding comes out sometimes because they think we talk about the Bible as just an alternative worldview. That's not the case. Worldview is the lenses we're using. The Bible is the authoritative source that refines those lenses so that we see the world properly as God has intended us to see the world.
Right. That is very helpful clarification. I appreciate that. I wanted to see if you could dive deeper into the 4 naturalistic views of truth or worldviews. You said Marxism, scientism, postmodernism, and relativism. A lot of people, I feel like the layperson may have heard these terms, especially
Yeah.
Marxism of recent, politics and whatnot.
Yeah.
But if you could define these and then explain how they apply or relate to absolute and temporal truths, like you do in your
Mhm.
part 2 video, I think that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, so when I pick all four of these, because all of these are naturalistic worldviews, all of them will accept some kind of temporal truth as true, one of our three temporal truths, but all of them reject the seed of truth, the absolute truth of God, right? Because there's God denied in all of those four worldview families. Okay,
Mm.
so that is the part of unity between all of those worldviews. And what I try to illustrate, and I use the little petals of the flowers and the different colors to try to make it visually, because I'm a visual learner, so that's why I do these videos. I try to make it memorable to my students because they're not going to learn all these names. And when I give these to my students, I don't even define all of these specifically. What is the definition of Marxism or postmodernism? Because definitions are easy to forget. But what I want them to understand is be able to recognize when they're having a conversation about truth and they ask somebody a certain question, how they respond to that. Once they can kind of sort of see what aspects of truth they accept or deny, then they can start to see how their worldview plays out. They can find points of commonality. Oh, we both accept this particular temporal truth. That's the beginning point for the conversation to point them to the need for absolute truth. And so the way I do it in this is I start with the idea of Marxism. And if anyone studied on Marxist stuff, I actually have some lectures that I've done that are available on morethancake.org. People can kind of watch some of my. I have hosted a conference a bunch of years back, and I have a longer talk on critical theory, critical race theory, and do some Marxist dialogues there. But Marxism will accept contingent truths. That is the observational, at least what their definition of scientific observational truths are, and synthetic truths, the cultural synthesis of ideas. And that's both of those are baked into the cake of the definitional side of what Marxism will do. Okay, so they're going to have contingent and synthetic. Scientism, which a lot of Christian apologists have written about. J.P. Moreland has whole books on this kind of concept. Uh, they will accept only really contingent truths. So they're going to reject the cultural synthesis as true, and they're going to reject the subjective sense of truth, the internal sense of what's right in us. Okay. Then if we look at postmodernism, now this is actually where I think most people misunderstand postmodernism. Definitionally they may get it right, but they don't understand what parts of truth it is. Postmodernism accepts both a subjective sense of truth, the sense of my truth, right, the internal feelings as true, but postmodernism also accepts synthetic truth, right? So here's now where we can start to see potentials for conflict. So you take a postmodernist who likes maybe communist ideas, but they're only going to accept the subjective, the internal sense, and the synthetic truth. Whereas maybe somebody who also likes communist ideals, but they're true Marxists, they're going to reject the sense of self, the sense of I. Because in true Marxism, there's only this group identity, right? The individual identity gets lost. So we can see even people that are say, "Oh, I'm a communist," or I'm a socialist. We want socialist ideas. Not all those people agree about what they count as truth. That's why we see conflicts even amongst these different kind of sort of say socialist categories. And then the last one we picked would be relativism, which is only going to accept these subjective kind of truth, the my truth kind of statements, my feelings. This is where we get sort of the transgender ideology and those sort of things, where only my sense of identity of sexuality or my likes or my preferences, that's only kind of truth I accept. Okay. And so those are the three basic, and again, the visual kind of helps solidify these. So if people want to go check that out, probably makes it a lot easier than just my pure description. But those are the four families of worldviews underneath naturalism, and where they disagree, even as naturalists, what the foundation of truth is.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I do agree. The illustration was helpful, but I think the way you described it was clear because even if you don't know what those terms mean, and you don't really, even if you just forgot the temporal truths, you could see the differences between them, in that one's approves of these, the other disagrees with these, and they clash with each other. So what's the solution? And then you look at Christianity, the supernaturalism, and both absolute and temporal truths seem to fit seamlessly in that
Mhm.
worldview. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely, because it's the absolute truth of God which makes sense of even the cultural truths or the my truth claims,
Mm.
right? So we could go with the synthetic, the cultural thing, and maybe that would help give an example of this. So the one of the example I use in the video that I don't actually go as in full as I explain it, but I say, uh, if I say slavery is illegal, right? Now that's a synthetic truth because that's a statement about what the law of the land is.
Mm.
But if I say to you, okay, is that cultural, is that synthetic truth, slavery is illegal, is that true if I were magically transported to, say, China or some parts of Africa? Well, that would no longer be true because in some places, slavery is not illegal, even now today. Or if we're standing here in the same room in the United States and we say, okay, we magically teleport ourselves back 150 years, that statement would be false. Now, here's where I think Christian apologists make sense. It doesn't mean that statement is not true. It just means that it's temporal. It's dependent on some set of circumstances for its truth value to remain consistent. So that's well and good. Okay, we can understand that. But here's the question is, why, is it the belief that it's illegal that is different than the question, is slavery wrong or is slavery right? Is it morally good to have that as a law? So if I'm purely a naturalist and I tie nothing to the absolute, well, you're left with this challenge of, well, I'd say it's not good for me, or I wouldn't support it, but I can't say it's wrong for somebody else to do that. And I go through these dialogues with my students, and quite frankly, surprisingly, a lot of them will say, well, yeah, I would vote against it, or I think it's wrong, but I can't say other cultures are wrong if they practice these things because they're so bought into this naturalistic framework, whatever category, whether you want to call them Marxists or, relativists or postmodernists, they all reject that absolute. So they're consistent in their struggle to make a moral claim, even about a cultural truth. And so only then when we say, okay, all humans are made sacred, B'Tselem Elohim is Genesis 1:27. We're all made in the image of God. So only when I can tie that claim that slavery is wrong to an absolute grounded in the nature of God who creates us in his image, can I say that there's a foundation, there's a root for that law, that synthetic truth, the cultural truth that slavery is wrong. Slavery is illegal, right? But to make the illegal claim and have it endure and not be changed with cultural shifts or scientific observations. Because when you look back into the middle of the 19th century, mid 1800s, there's a shift that happened in the United States. Slavery was always legal, but you get to about 1859, 1860, the shift was that slavery was actually a moral good. It wasn't a morally necessary evil, which was the previous perception of it. But you get into the mid of the 19th century, and the belief came to be in large part because of philosophy, and then Darwinian naturalism kind of comes in. It was the belief that it was actually a moral good. I'm actually doing good by enslaving this lower race of people because they need this system to survive, because they can't survive without the control and the system of slavery. They can't thrive without that. And so that was the argument. So if you're going to protect against those shifts of what's politically right or wrong, you need to tie it to an absolute. And only the Christian worldview can provide that.
Wow, that's really helpful, and it comes back to that foundation. It seems to me these four naturalistic views or worldviews, they're living in the vase, right? They don't have that absolute, they don't have that seed, and then the Christian worldview is living in the soil with the seed and has everything from this foundation upward. It's such a good illustration, but I wanted to ask you, out of the four that you listed here, which one do you think is most common that you think the next generation, or maybe just people in general, are being hit with the hardest at the moment? I ask because I see scientism, and I would think maybe that was more popular during the new atheist reign. So which one of these would you think is the most popular?
Yeah, I don't think scientism is that relevant to the next generation. A lot of apologists are still making arguments against it, which is necessary, but I just think that
Mm,
it's not really the boots on the ground kind of issue that's there. I think Marxism politically is significant because there's a lot of political sway, but that's really within the halls of academia. I mean, certainly it's filtered down into the ethos of political movements. But I think that I don't think it's as problematic. I don't even think postmodernism right now is the most difficult of those, although I think it's a close second. I think the idea of relativism is the most significant. And I would put it there not because the thing that throws it over the top for me is not just that it's culturally persuasive, persuasive, like the emphasis on my feelings as the source of truth and the only source of truth. I believe that's always going to be destructive. But I put it there because I also think the apologetic response by Christians to attack, say that there is no my truth or your truth, there's only the truth. I think it's the completely wrong approach to that relativistic claim
mm,
because we put everybody into one worldview camp. One of the things I hope that people realize is that, again, more than one postmodernism accepts subjective truths as true. Christianity accepts subjective truths as true. So because if they correspond to reality. So I give an example. I gave a talk at Evangelical Theological Society this last year, and I knew I'd probably get canceled by some of the popular apologist people just because I kind of go against the grain on this. But I was surprised they even got it accepted. And you can find a video of that at morethancake.org. But I talk about this idea that Paul in the New Testament, he talks about, my God and my Savior, and, my salvation. When we personalize these concepts of what is true, does it make them false? There's a
mm,
sense biblically, and the Psalms are full of this. The Old Testament is full of this. Movies are full of this concept. When we say something is my truth, we mean it's a truth apprehended. It's a truth that I accept for me, a truth that will guide my life. So I can just the absolute truth. If there's an objective truth that Jesus Christ is God and he died and he rose from the end, that's great. But if that truth is not also my truth, then it's meaningless because I'm still bound to an eternal separation from God and hell. So it has to also be my truth. But my truth doesn't exclude it as an objective truth. And I think so I think this one is so important is because when we tell people there is no such thing as my truth, and I get it because we're concerned about relativistic worldviews, but what we do is we cut people off from accessing the truth of the gospel lived out. Francis Schaeffer does a great job of this. He explains that you could be believe that love, you could go he talks about being in France, right? Along the Seine, walking along the Champs-Élysées or something like that, right? And two lovers are holding hands and embracing and they have this feeling of love. Well, their love is a cut flower, right? They're living in the vase, as you pointed out, right? They have this squishy, oh, it's so beautiful, and I'm romantically involved, or I have sexual, physical attraction to you. But now, oh, life gets hard, and I no longer have fallen out of love with you, right? But but even they apprehend something true about the eternal God. Their sense that love is real, that I want to have this relationship, that I need relationship, points them to something that they deny is real, but their feeling is actually pointing to that absolute, that we are made as image bearers of God for relationship, for community, to love, to sacrifice, to share. All of those feelings of truth point to something that is true, but they only understand the my truth aspect of that. So, but if I begin apologetically by saying, well, your feelings are not real, that's not real love, or your love is false, then all I've done is tell them that their perceptions of the world are always wrong.
mm,
Well, then I need to convince them that Jesus is true and their perceptions of Jesus are true. but I've already told them that all their perceptions are wrong. It's just not a great way to reach that group of people. And so I think that actually becomes the most important worldview framework, the relativistic worldview, because it's the one that Christians are getting wrong in our apologetic approach.
Really good. And unfortunately, I think this relativism is not just out there beyond the church, but it's within the church. And it's a good segue into the next question I have for you. It's kind of a long setup here, so forgive me. But on this program, I've said plenty of times this Barna research study that came out, I believe in 2024, where Barna found that only 4% of self-professing Christians have a biblical worldview, and only 12% of youth pastors and 30% of pastors have a biblical worldview. So my next question when I hear that is, what does he mean by biblical worldview? It must be something extensive, but to my surprise, it was very brief and basic. Here's how he defines it: as believing in that absolute moral truth exists, the Bible is totally accurate in all of its principles it teaches. Satan is considered to be a real being or force, not merely symbolic. A person cannot earn their way into heaven by trying to be good or do good works. Jesus Christ lived a sinless life on earth, and God is the all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the world who still rules the universe today. So 96% of U.S. adults who profess Christianity reject at least one of those points. Um, and instead, what they hold to, which I found quite surprising in one sense, but then when I thought about it deeper, not too much, is syncretism. And they just essentially throw a whole bunch of truths from worldviews into a bag and slap the label Christianity on it. So I wanted to get your take on syncretism. What is it beyond my maybe kind of elementary illustration? And then where do you find problems with that worldview?
Yeah, so first I would say that I do my own surveys of students. So I have about a little under 300 students a semester. So I've been at Grand Canyon now for 3 years. This will start my fourth year in the fall. So I've had well over 1,000 or like I think 1,500 or 1,600 students, something like whatever it is. A lot of students. And I survey them about different worldviews, some of those ideas. And what I find is 70% of my class will say that they are Christian, but when I start looking at their papers and then reading their stuff, it's probably like 7, 8, maybe 10% of them actually are,
Wow.
of those that claim to be, because they don't actually have a Christian worldview. They don't actually see it that way,
Hmm.
but they categorize themselves. So numbers a little bit different. You'd expect that maybe at a Christian university to be a little bit higher than the general survey that say a Barna would do, but still surprisingly that number is not where we would hope it would be for those claiming to be a Christian. So it is a problem, and I do see that sort of syncretism in their answers. They'll say, yes, I'm a Christian. I believe that Jesus is God. And what's your foundation for right? Well, it's all based on my feelings or what I believe to be true. Or my family is really the source of what is everything that is right. Or, well, yes, I believe Jesus is God and that all of our moral truth is tied to the universe, which is conscious and aware and it has identity. And so they'll mix pantheism and Christianity. It's like just these weird mixings of all these sort of things. Which is why, like, even in the video that we just talked about, where I talk about these different worldview families, I don't really emphasize really the definitions of all of those. I mean, I give them in the class just so they have an idea, something to work with, but I don't really emphasize memorizing those. I'd rather focus on what do they accept as truth as a practical sense, not what they label themselves, because what the people label themselves just simply isn't true. So the labels do help us as Christians think through conversations with people. Oh, I see that they're leaning this way. But they can also mislead us if we think because they have the label atheist, that means that they think the same way that every other atheist thinks, right? It's just not going to be the case. So to part of that question, yes, I do think that that exists. I think part of that, the reason we have this sort of syncretistic Christian faith is partly because we've had poor teaching in our churches for my entire life, thus the more than cake kind of concept. We just have superficial. I just watched this whole thing is viral now, these at the movie themes of churches, and they're these big mega churches that the pastor dresses up like, Mario, and they have their churches decorated. These sort of what I've always called is sort of the five happy hops to a better life type sermonizing, where you do these things and your life will be better. Do these six things and your marriage will be perfect. So the five happy hops to a better, you name it, right? That's the core of what gets taught as a pragmatism, but it's not tied to a substantial understanding of a Christian worldview or doctrine, the historic doctrine. And so that's the challenge I do see. So I think I answered your question in there of like, am I seeing that? But you might have had something else in there that I missed.
Yeah, my follow up to that was, how would you, let's say a Christian came up to you, maybe one of your students, and was like, "Yeah, I hold to syncretism." What would you say to him to show the flaws in syncretism and why he should go away
Yeah.
from that belief?
Yeah. So what I find there's no, and this is why this is why you can't write a book on this. This is unfortunately it doesn't sell well, which means it's not going to be an easy answer, but it's the right answer. It's just not a bumper sticker slogan. The truth is, I'm going to have a conversation to find out what they value the most, what issue they care about the most. What I'm going to try to find is where do they have an issue that they're passionate on? So say like today, issues of justice, like racial justice or whatever that might be. And I've got to see, do they have a worldview grounded in what is true and biblically true or about the nature of God? Or have they just have a syncretistic cultural view, right? They accept it as true. Racism is bad. But is that a synthetic cultural belief and that would easily shift if the culture shifts? Or is it tied to something that's absolute? So I got to find an issue they care about. Could be environment, could be whatever, sex trafficking, you name it. Or if it could just be simply, actually, I use this one all the time, somebody's being abused by a boyfriend or girlfriend. Is it wrong to be abused by that person? Should they leave that relationship? Even fundamental answers like to that, if they can't tie it to the absolute, they're not going to have an enduring answer to persuade somebody. Because I've counseled with young people in college that, hey, my roommate's not a Christian and she's being abused by her boyfriend, but she said, but he loves me. Okay, well, what does love mean? What is that? Do you, it's one thing to believe that, but then you think you don't like being abused. But the real question is, do you deserve not to be abused? Do you deserve better treatment by this person? So if we can find an issue like that, then you have to lead them through, okay, will you accept this based on your feeling, my truth? I feel like I should be treated better. But now I've got to tie that my truth feeling to an absolute truth that one, you are created in the image of God ultimately, and that you deserve not to be abused, that you deserve to be loved. And that the only source of foundation that's going to ground that belief, that the my truth of I want to be loved, is going to be grounding it in the truth of God and that you're created as sacred regardless of sin. So it doesn't matter if you've been abused in the past, it doesn't matter if you've been a bad boyfriend or girlfriend, you have intrinsic worth as an image bearer of God, and that can never be taken away. And once you draw people to those sort of absolute things, then you start to show them how their syncretistic views can't survive worldview tests. So I've got a video on the 3 worldview tests, and you've got to start to test these things. And so learning those worldview tests, seeing where their worldview is inconsistent, then finding which test will point those issues to the need for consistency. That's a long process. It's going to take conversation. It's going to take dialogue. It's going to take thinking like, hey man, you bring up something great. Let me go research this. And now you're going to have to figure out, how do I direct them back to that? But that's really the process. The answer is relationship. To the truth of it is investing. And this is why sort of when our ideal for Christian apologetics is the sage on the stage or what we read in an academic book, those are good. Those have a place. I'm not arguing against any of those things. But what I'm saying is the apologia, the apologetics that you and I do is through the context of relationship, which is also breeds accountability. In other words, we can follow up. We can have, hey, we talked about this last week. How's that going? We can't do that through a book or through a wise speaker on a stage or through a podcast. You have a relationship with somebody that I will never have, and you have to invest in them, bringing them to understand these core concepts.
So good. Yeah, it's all about relationship. And to me, it's what makes the comment section a bit hard on social media. I think
Yes.
our culture has really dug into or just, approved of the drop the mic statements. Like, oh, I'm going to go on that
Ugh.
video and just drop the mic.
Uh,
And it doesn't further the
uh,
conversation at all, right? So, and
yeah.
the temptation for us Christians, and I've felt fallen for this as well, is I'm going to respond back with a drop the mic, but
Yeah.
then really nothing has been done except I sound just as ignorant, right? And that's not representing
Jacob
Christ.
devastates the atheist with his response.
Yeah, as if
Jacob
someone's going to write that.
destroys this atheist with his, they can't even respond. Okay, that's not.
Right, right. And what would that
Where
even
our
do?
call is to win people, not arguments, and
That's
that's
right.
that's the challenge. That's the difference.
That's right. So I love what you said, a relationship, testing worldviews. And that actually leads to my final question, which is somewhat of a similar one, but from a different perspective. So let's say, I know a lot of people, I grew up in an agnostic household. So we didn't have a religion and we didn't talk about any of this stuff. We didn't talk about
Mhm.
truth. We didn't talk about any of it. We just lived. And a lot of family members have prided themselves on, or people that I know, of, well, I don't have a religion. Like a neutral card, I don't have a religion. I'm not like the extreme Muslims. I'm not like the extreme Christians. I'm just nothing. What would you say to them to wake them up in the sense of, well, you are something, you just haven't labeled it as such yet? What would you say to that person?
Um, I wouldn't even care about the label so much. I'd have to just start with questions. What are the
Mm,
things you care about in life? What matters to you? What are the moral thing? Because I think the argument for morality, I think, is the most significant argument
mm,
uh, we have today. What is moral truth? Because that's where people live. They don't live in the world of academics. They don't live in, arguments about the Kalam cosmological argument, which I'm not dismissing the value of, because there are people that is persuasive to, that can point them to God and then eventually to the truth of Scripture. And so I don't mean to dismiss that outright, but I'm saying the vast majority of your friends and my friends sitting around playing cards some night, or at family Thanksgiving, the Kalam cosmological argument is irrelevant, because you look at the this gets to a sort of a sad state of things. It's less about the apologetic issues. It's more about the sad state of education. If you look at people, we can't process complex arguments. I have students that can't read a chapter, that have never read a chapter book, and they can't read a chapter book because they can't carry the line of reasoning from one chapter through the next. And which is one of the reasons why I do the 5-minute videos, because I'm trying to say, can I take these complex ideas, boil them down to something digestible for somebody with an attention span of a sparrow? And can I at least generate some conversation from
mm,
this? And so it's more of a practical, pragmatic concern that I have than an actual, it's not a critique of the arguments themselves. It's just sort of, this is where we're at culturally. And so I don't worry at all about the labels, because, like I said, labels are for me, not for you. And you recognizing you have a label really doesn't help. What I have to do is recognize, what do you accept as truth? This is why these videos are so important. What do you accept? Do you accept the my truth only? Do you accept the synthetic or the contingent? As an agnostic, do you think there's even the possibility of the absolute? Do you want, I guess the thing is, you have to get people to want there to be an absolute. Like, even if
right.
you don't believe there's an absolute, I have to convince you that you want there to be an absolute. You
Mm,
want your mom to love you. You want the belief that when your wife or your husband says I do, that they really meant it, that there's something true there. There's a true truth behind that, not just a subjective, cultural, for the moment, emotional commitment. But you want to believe that, for better, for worse, richer, poorer, sickness and health, sickness and in death, right? That they are there to love you. You want that to be true. And so we have to find those things that people are passionate about, the things they need to be true, and then point them to say, well, regardless of what label we use for your worldview, I want to show you why that desire, that deep feeling you have, my belief that my love is real, is tied to something real. And that you not only want it, the reason you have a desire for it is because that is how God has made you. And if I can convince them that their feeling is tied to an absolute reality, and that's what they're longing for, is the stability of their feelings, the stability of their emotions, and that stability, like you said, not living in the vase, but living grounded and rooted in the seed of God and the seed of Christ. If I can give them that desire, then they'll want to believe. And then at that point, honestly, it's the work of the Holy Spirit. I can give them arguments, but this is where prayer. When I used to do this on college campus when I was a student at Penn State, I was an engineering student, and I'd be in these dialogues. I would be praying. So I'm talking to Jacob, and hey, we're talking about, is the Bible reliable? And you'd be giving me your thoughts, and I'd always be praying, okay, God, Jacob really doesn't care about the reliability of the New Testament. What's the thing he really cares about? And then you'd say something, and I'd say, aha, I think this is it. Well, Jacob, you said that, but when we talk about the reliability of it, you talk about growing up and you went to a church and they said something that really hit you hard. You couldn't believe that must be true. Why is that issue important to you? I had this, so I'd always be praying, what's the issue? What's the question behind the question? Can I give one real example of this that might help too?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Um, yeah. So when I'll go back to again my college days when I discovered this truth. There was a guy who was hired by the university. His job was actually to be a liaison between the university and LGB students. There was no TQIA, Two Spirit Plus back then. That's how old I am. But that's how quickly everything changes, right? But he was an LGB representative. But his goal was to actually reach out to Christian students on the campus to help them get connected to Christian groups on campus. Believe it or not, a secular university hired a guy who was a liaison to LGBT community so that they could get tied to Christian groups on campus that would support their moral views on this stuff. So he's at this event. We were talking. I was like, okay, God, I want to meet this guy. So I get a chance. I go in to set up the time. We meet in his office. And I'm in there thinking, okay, I know it's like I listened to his talk, and he said the Bible doesn't say that homosexuality is wrong, and I've got the verses, and I've got all the arguments. I'm ready for this. And in about 5 minutes, I realized nothing I had planned to say was relevant because he told me a story. And he said, look, you have an advantage. He said, you can go into any church and ask a question about the Bible, and they will answer your question. If I go in and ask a question about the Bible, they're going to try to convert me, or they're going to try to change me. They're not even going to answer my questions. And I do think it was wrong because I don't think that's true. I don't think actually, sadly, I wish it was true that I could go in any church and ask a question and they'd answer. I don't think that's really true, but it should be true, but it's not. But he was right. I went in there with the idea I'm going to change this guy instead of thinking about actually answering his questions about the Bible. And what I discovered is he actually believed the Bible did teach that homosexuality is a sin. He just didn't believe that part of the Bible was true. So even though publicly he's saying the Bible doesn't say this, what he meant by this is it does say it, but I believe that part is false. But nobody ever talked about the authority of Scripture, why the Bible is reliable, all these other sort of things. They just wanted to talk about his homosexuality. And so I think this is part of the challenge is when we find labels hopefully I'm answering your question, but when we
No, you
find
are.
these labels and we think we attach the label to somebody, then we think we have the textbook set of answers because we listen to a podcast with an apologist or some, bonehead like me giving some answers, right? Oh, I've got the answers. But the truth is, more important to labels are the actual substance of what do they accept as truth, what moral issues are they passionate about, and how can I use those issues to point them to the person of Jesus Christ and to the
Mm.
true gospel, because that's going to transcend all the labels that we have.
That's so good. And that's a great story. I mean, it goes to show like how labels can be, I think, idolized in a sense. Like we idolize the
Mhm.
label and it could really disrupt our evangelism. If we look at someone and they're an atheist, maybe we'll go after their atheism. But what you said was fantastic. Find the question under the question or something to that effect. And that's brilliant because there's a lot of smoke screens that get thrown up. I
Mhm.
think one of them that comes up all the time is the Kalam cosmological argument when that's presented, and they say, "Who created God?" And I honestly think that's a smokescreen because I don't think there's much
Yeah.
substance to it. But it's
Yeah.
like, what is the truth behind their objection, and why are they rejecting God? Which Romans 1 tells
Mhm.
us everyone knows that there is a God.
Yeah.
So I really think that was helpful, and I did follow that with my own family. And that, you might not say you're an agnostic or an atheist or a Christian, but you do have
Hmm.
a worldview. You view the world in some
Yes.
way. Like, why do you think I'm valuable? Why do you think you're valuable? Like, where does that come from? So it's,
Hmm.
and then to your point, it goes down to worldview and foundation. So just really good stuff, Joe. I think this episode was extremely helpful for me. Speaking with you and going through your videos, it's just super insightful. So to our listeners again, morethancake.org for the information.com for the cake if you want it. Joe, thank you so much for jumping on.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it. I'm glad we were able to work this out and come together and make it happen. God bless in all your
Definitely.
ministry too and on your podcast.
Thank you so much. Well, to our listeners, thanks for tuning in, and God bless.